Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm James Corliss. I'm Executive Director of the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. We have an excellent webinar this morning. I know we've got a lot of interest from all around the region on this topic. It's timely. I think it's going to be somewhat sobering, frankly, to hear from some of our presenters this morning about just how bad things are in the out on Main Street with small businesses, with retail. And so that is part of our title here is Tough Lessons for Brick and Mortar and Local Governments. But we've got two excellent presenters. A couple of things just to kick this off. I really want to thank our ongoing partners through the Economic Prosperity Partnership here in the Sacramento region. The Metro Chamber, of course, is going to be speaking this morning, but also our partnership with the Greater Sacramento Economic Council, the Sacramento Asian Pacific Chamber, Valley Vision. This is really a follow-on to the Prosperity Strategy report that was released in May that really called for many things, including a very strong pro-business friendly environment, a small business friendly environment. Much of those recommendations were put forth before the pandemic hit. And now, of course, we find ourselves with many of our small businesses and local retail on the ropes. I probably don't have to tell many of you, if you're on the line this morning, just how important small business and local retail is to our region and our economy. But let me give you some stats. Statewide, 4 million small businesses make up nearly 99% of the state's businesses. They employ 7 million people. Nearly half of all the state employees work for small business. And almost half of all small businesses are owned by people of color. So for us, for SACOG, the notion of retail and strong retail and reviving commercial corridors and thriving downtowns is important from a long-term perspective. It's important from a transportation perspective, a walkability perspective, meeting our greenhouse gas targets and our quality of life targets, but frankly also it's a really important racial equity strategy because this small business is wealth building. It's wealth building for all of the people in our region who own these small businesses, who run them. And again, the last 4 months has been dire in terms of the news. So let me get to the speakers. We've got two fantastic speakers this morning. We've got Michele Reeves, who will kick it off, and Michelle's an urban strategist with a ton of experience in terms of revitalizing mixed-use districts, downtowns, advancing placemaking strategies, looking at retail leasing strategies, development consulting and project management. In her consulting practice at Civilis, she helps cities and communities renew urban places by teaching building blocks for successful revitalization, as she's doing right now, by the way. And we're thrilled to be engaging her as much as we are. And I know so many of our member local governments just call me up and thank me after Michele has been for a visit. Through our Rural Main Streets project, Michele is lending her expertise and advice, her very direct and frank advice, which we always really appreciate, to many of our local governments and our local retailers across the region. Our second speaker, Erika Bjork, is a destination marketing expert, policy strategist with the Sacramento Metro Chamber of Commerce. Her background is really diverse and varied. It's in marketing. She's worked with the Sacramento Kings, Sacramento Republic FC, and destinations like downtown Napa over in the Bay Area, helping it recover from the 2008 economic recession. But over the last 4 months, Erika has told me she has probably been on the phone with small business owners every single day through the pandemic. So Michele and Erika have presentations. We're trying to get this after the presentations to be a little bit of conversational format. We want to invite you to be part of that conversation as well. So if you have questions and you're in the audience, please use the chat function and we'll make sure that there's some time for Michele and Erika to answer those later. So without further ado, I want to introduce Michele Reeves, whose topic is Doom and Gloom for Whom? I always love rhymes. As much as I love alliteration, should retailers, property owners, or banks bear the brunt of the economic damage? Michele, take it away.
All right, so we are going to move into some screen share. Anybody who has seen my presentations knows that there is no slide deck too long for me. Okay, so is that up for everyone? Can you see that? Okay, so before I start into the doom and gloom, I want to just give a little bit of acknowledgement to all the women who are using this time to stop dyeing their hair and go natural, of which I am one, and I'm rocking the two-tone hairstyle. So shout out to all my sisters. So I just wanted to make a side COVID note is, as I was pulling this picture up, I just feel like the Bride of Frankenstein really just embodies every way I feel about quarantine and being forced to stay at home. Dress, hair, just emotion. So she's now sort of my COVID spirit animal after putting this together. I wanted to say my job in this sort of shindig today is to take 10 minutes and do a deep dive, as much as you can in 10 minutes, into kind of a reality check about the impacts of COVID on the brick and mortar environment. But before I do that, I just want to thank SACOG for the invite. I want to thank my fellow panelists, and I want to thank all of you guys for coming here today. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in. This is what I'm going to cover today, and I've got about 10 minutes to do it. So as anyone who's seen me present knows, trying to cram all my content into 10 minutes is kind of like torture. And I should warn you, we've got an average of about one slide every 12 seconds in this presentation. So I'm going to kick it off by sharing with you how I'm looking at the world today in terms of economic development and COVID. I'm breaking the world down into two kinds of people. So the first kind of person is a brick and mortar person. These are the people who are involved in businesses that are open to the public, occupy ground floor spaces in commercial districts, and cross-pollinate with each other to drive sales. These are the businesses that are hardest hit by COVID. So they're being devastated right now. The other kind of people in the world are work from home people. So this second group of folks, they don't go into the office anymore. COVID for them is a bit of an inconvenience. And they're kind of thinking like, it's a good time to build a fence or maybe buy a second home in the country. So I have to be honest, when you spend a day with your head down, working in the trenches in the brick and mortar world, and then you pop your head up and you interact with the work from home people, you just feel like you're in this terrible Twilight Zone episode, and that half the country doesn't understand that we're in the midst and on the brink of a true economic crisis. So let's look at what I mean by that a little bit more. You guys know, or at least some of you do, I'm an engineer. I like numbers. I like market data. You don't get mad at market data. You just got to respond to market data. So I want to look at some of the key areas that are impacting brick and mortar right now and why I think this is such a dire situation that we are not bringing enough tools and the right tools to the table. Number one, travel is way down. The U.S. Travel Association estimates that $505 billion in travel spending is going to evaporate just this year in 2020. That means $81 billion in lost tax revenue related to travel, and they don't expect recovery until 2024. Work from home is killing commercial districts that depend on business travelers and office workers. And you know what? Neither of those groups are coming back anytime soon. So that is going to impact every center city in the country. Layoffs, this is a very obvious one. So we are a consumer economy. We need employed people who can spend money. And the fewer of those that we have, the worse it is for everyone. And it's really scary. I just periodically will hop onto Google and just Google search layoffs, just kind of see what the latest is. And the list and the breadth, it's really frightening. Health and safety, this is a big one. People don't want to spend time indoors, especially not near people who are aspirating heavily, whether they are singing, shouting, cheering, or chatting. So obviously that has a gigantic impact on the brick and mortar ecosystem. There's a little side note, I'm actually a huge minor league hockey fan. Many of you may not know that. And so this is a picture from a Portland Winter Hawks game. And I'm going to be so depressed if this season is canceled. Here this year, and it probably will be. And there are so many ways in which these impacts are really hurting us as social animals and social beings. And this is an example of not being able to interact in entertainment venues or sporting venues in this way. So the last bit of market data that I wanted to touch on is that COVID is having a larger impact on BIPOC communities, not just in terms of infection rates and survival rates, but also in terms of negative impacts for businesses of color. And that's something that we have to do better about, and I'm going to touch on at the end of my presentation. So if any one of these things was happening, it would dramatically hurt the economy, but they're all happening together. And so it's truly putting our economy completely on the edge. So what do we do with all of this happy information that I just gave you? Well, you know, as I keep mentioning, we got 10 minutes. I'm going to leave you with 3 quick thoughts. So the first thought is we need to protect small business. And I want you to notice that I didn't say we need to just willy-nilly open small business. That's not what we need to do. We need to protect small business, because if we don't, we are going to see waves of even more closures. So I just want to share with you, I thought this was really interesting. So Yelp has been tracking closures, and they have found that between March 1st and June 15th, of the closures that they were tracking, 41% had become permanent closures. That is a scary number. That is a number that should scare the crap out of all of us. And if we don't really think about protecting true small brick and mortar business as a priority in this DEFCON 1 emergency, we're going to lose more small businesses. So I want to share what they're facing right now. Number one, decreased sales. My rule of thumb is most of the businesses that are eking it out and still open right now have managed to get back up to about 50% of 2019 sales. These small businesses are running out of Triple P money. I want to note that this program was not helpful for most brick and mortar businesses. I call it the "we'll make you pay for employees you don't need" program, right? So why should a yoga studio be forced to hire yoga teachers when they can't even be open as a grant program to help small businesses? Commercial eviction moratoriums are expiring all around the country, and this is leaving tenants at the mercy of their landlords. This is a problem because almost no tenants can afford whatever rent they were obligated to pay under their lease in 2020. So if their landlord isn't going to kick them a deal, a lot of them are just going to go out of business because of that. I want to remind everyone that if people did not pay rent under a commercial eviction moratorium, it's going to become due. They are obligated to repay all of that rent as well. They usually have some sort of loan burden. They might have a tenant improvement loan, they have inventory loans, they have lines of credit to try and bridge some of the challenges that they have right now. Adding to that is the people who are going out and trying to get capital right now. What I'm hearing from small brick and mortar businesses is the doors are closed. So it's now almost impossible to get access to capital for the people that need it, especially if they're small. It's hard to get staff back. That is one of the #1 things that I hear. I do not want people to say that it's because employees are lazy or they just love getting unemployment and they have no interest in working. Most employees are really concerned about safety, not only their own, but customer safety. And I gotta be honest, if my choice was to risk my life to paint somebody's toenails or be able to get unemployment insurance, I'd be pretty excited about unemployment insurance. And then the last thing is something that almost nobody knows about, but it is a huge, huge issue for small business, and that is personal guarantees. So nearly every small business has a personal guarantee on their lease. And this means that they are personally responsible for every dime owed under the life of the lease. And a landlord can bypass the business entity and immediately go after the personal assets of the business owner. And because of this, nearly every small business person is currently thinking not only facing business bankruptcy, but also facing personal bankruptcy as well. So I want to read you a quote, and this was something that a woman-owned business sent to me about her landlord at the beginning of this journey with her landlord, and it's really moving. She said, "I'm frustrated that he doesn't think this will ever cost him a cent. He'll get his money, but later and interest-free, despite the fact that I won't get my money later. I'm on food stamps, he's got multiple homes. I'm the biggest paying tenant. Somehow I have the burden of feeding my kid and also his." I want to be clear that there is no equivalency between someone like me as a commercial property owner losing a building and someone like this business owner who has lost everything. We cannot have a repeat of the last recession where Main Street footed the bailout for the entire economy. In the brick and mortar ecosystem, lenders should absorb the most, property owners the next most, and business owners the least. So back to my thought about protecting small business, I think one of the most critical things we could do right now to truly protect true small brick and mortar business, I'm not talking about the Shake Shack, is to give them the ability to close, move, consolidate, and negotiate with their landlords by allowing them a one-time option to terminate their lease for minimal penalty, including personal guarantees, if they can prove that they have been significantly impacted by COVID. But regardless, we should always be setting our policy around the idea of who benefits from the bottom of the food chain up, so that the cost of unintended consequences are moved up that financial food chain and not down. So the next two thoughts I'm going to pass through very, very quickly, being cognizant of my time limit. So the next one is what I call test, track, and transform. And this comes from the work that I do in helping brick and mortar businesses be more successful. And this is a fundamental truth of being in the brick and mortar game. And that is it's about reinvention. Okay, so you can kind of see in the background of that slide there, this is an ad for a union suit. We don't buy union suits anymore, right? Test, track, transform. We are always reinventing who we are in retail. So fitness classes sure don't look like your grandpa's fitness classes anymore, which I think is a very good thing. So we have to constantly be thinking about, all of us, everyone who has some piece of the brick and mortar game has to be thinking about how they're testing new things, tracking how they do, and then transforming based on the information that we got back from that. And so that means we need short timelines and lots of iteration. This is not a set it and forget it situation. And I especially need the public sector to jump on board with this. That means getting out of your silos and your bureaucracies and your that's not the way we do it approaches. This is a DEFCON 1 emergency for small business. The last thing that I want to talk about is intentionality. So one of the most common outcomes of economic disasters are that people of color permanently lose accumulated wealth, and income inequalities get exacerbated in ways that just do not happen for white people. I think it's really interesting how much of our economic development responses in times of disaster come with a pretty healthy dose of systemic racism. And I think a great place to look at how those policies can kind of be a death of a thousand cuts is to look at the complete decimation of the Black middle class in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. So that means in the face of this disaster, we need to think about how we're test tracking and transforming around intentionality to set concrete goals and track results so that this does not happen this time around. So that is a very quick pass through of 3 thoughts related to the market data that I just shared earlier and what I wanted to cover today. And I feel like it's a little bit of a guess. I should like punch out and be like, boom, 10 minutes. I think I got close. So I am going to stop sharing. And I think now I'm going to be handing it off to Erika.
All right, I'm going to pull my self view back up. Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate that. Okay, so we started with a little bit of the doom and gloom, and by all means, I think I want to recognize very much everything that Michelle said. This is trying times. I think, and probably a great example of this at the Metro Chamber, we operate the Northern California SPDC. And when we started off, our focus was very much on, helping people try to connect with financing, helping them try to pivot. How can they navigate and give support services to their employees? And I think one of the most challenging things for many of them was, kind of to Michelle's point, as they stopped operating, it was breaking their hearts of many of them were literally continuing to fund paychecks, even though they were not operating, and doing whatever they can to keep their employees going. So helping them figure out and navigate, is it better almost to fire your employee and go on EDD? What services are there? And I think one of the key things that is always amazing about small businesses is, again, at their core and their heart, they're entrepreneurs. And they started with an idea and a dream or a problem to solve. And for many of them, they have learned they've had to pivot. But in the same regard, we also recognize, I think one of the key things is, again, we started with giving advice on, how to make a safe environment. And now we're working on giving them literally mental health advice. This is, I think, the context, and understand too, as a small business, you're very much tied to the passion of what you build and everything that goes with it. And when you lose that, you feel like you lose a little sense of yourself. So there's a couple of key things, though, that I think are important. And maybe one thing that I will say in kind of knowing me is I'm a big fan of history and context, and I always feel that history is repeating itself to a point. So I'm going to pull up a screen here for a second. And I think one of the key things to know is, again, unfortunately, this is not our first pandemic. And one of those elements that goes with that is, again, and I think our business community It's also not the first time that we have dealt with disruption. So at the end of the day, this is not business as normal, but it is still business. And we are seeing examples, and if you want to talk about some of the silver linings, both in our small businesses, but also in some of our neighborhoods, our main streets, our commercial corridors that can provide some opportunities that lie ahead. I think a key thing here that I'm going to probably talk about and center on two key things is you got to look at, as humans as a whole, I think everything kind of boils down to people in place. And at the end of the day, and again, to Michelle's comments, things are changing, but we're still creatures of habit. We're still consumers, and we're still buying. We just have found other ways to buy. We are buying online. We have seen literally what takes 10 years in e-commerce to happen in literally 3 months. We are seeing, in many regards, we saw signs of things changing previously. Our malls not being necessarily that focus and that destination to our retail consumers. The ability to embrace our artisan communities and similar. All that we're seeing, and kind of, I think to a degree, almost hyper-focused. And whether it's people being focused on their local community, how can I help my local shopkeeper, that brick and mortar? And they may be purchasing differently. They may be doing it online. They may be doing it through customized Instagram personal shopping, but they're still finding ways to do it. And it still goes back to that relationship between customer and business. And with that, let's not lose sight of the other customer group here, and the other business too is, to Michelle's point, is, businesses are also a customer of our local civic entities and our governments. And so if you want to look at it as this three-legged stool between customer, business, and government, at the end of the day, if all three of us are not working together in a collaborative fashion, there will be no silver lining. We will not get out of this stronger on the other side. And there's some key critical things we need to look at now that are going to also do that. Again, going back, this not being our first pandemic, the transition, the change that we saw in things like contactless purchasing and similar, that skyrocketed out of the 2003 SARS in China. It was a catalyst to things that we were going to see here. It has accelerated it, but it was probably the direction of where life was already going. So it goes back to, at our core, we're still going to shop. We're still going to want to gather. How we do it is going to be different. And I think one of the key things for anyone watching this is, I know there is no, we'll just say, magic ball that's going to tell us what things are going to look like in the next few months. But I think it's pretty clear that there is what we may have anticipated business to look at, if that is from a revenue standpoint, if that's from anything else, it is not going to look like that, not only for the next 12 months, but probably for the next 2 years or more. We will not have a normal situation, if you want to say, of how we shopped, of how we did things in a communal standpoint. I come from sports. It is an odd experience to watch sports online with no fans in the stands, but we're finding ways to do it and to integrate it. To a degree, I think it shows the innovation of one business sector trying to pivot, to stay engaged with their fans and their audiences. They're just doing it in a very different way. And I think for most of us, it's kind of happening on devices like this. But they are finding ways to do it. So again, at the core of anything that's going on for our businesses, think about what is the relationship between you and your customer. How can you tie that together? Because it doesn't matter if your storefront is open or your storefront's online. It's going to be a key and critical thing to it. The second piece is going to be talking about place. So for most of us, this is our environment and our space, and we are working from home. Home is redefined, so to speak. And we go back to, I think with this, there is more than anything opportunity. There's a few examples I'm going to go to. So first and foremost, let's look at remote work. Again, just accelerate tremendously based on all of this, but there are key things that still keep us together. We would still want to be connected. So about 5-6 years ago, you had many companies that tried to kind of do the telework experiment, and it did not work because we did not quite have tools like Zoom, where you could still connect and you could still see each other. This has created a new opportunity, and I think this is where, especially for some of our commercial corridors and our main streets, even more so. So you have, and you've already seen places like a Tulsa that had programs trying to recruit people to move to their small cities and remote work. This has again accelerated it, where people are leaving some of these bigger metropolitans to go to smaller communities and places that have the brick and mortar, that have the mom and pop shops that they still need, from the walkable and the livable and the kind of key areas that tie them back to that. And with that, we go back to how those smaller communities can now attract those people, not only to live there, to work there now, and to play there. And granted, we got to build a little bit of that up before we can be out in public. there's a couple things I'm going to show some examples, and Michelle talked about this, I think, with travel and tourism, which I actually feel there's opportunity to this. So one of the places I actually visited recently was Caldwell, Idaho. And I think it is a great example of, it's a small little community outside of Boise, Idaho, struggled over the years, like many communities you talk about. In the 80s, malls were built, everyone kind of moved out, right? And so with this, you know, the community kind of a few years ago with the business community and the Chamber of Commerce said, what can we do to attract people back? And one of the big focus was Indian Creek Plaza. They wanted a place where they could gather. And I think one of the key things you can kind of see here a little bit is everything is forward facing on that brick and mortar business, right? So that has developed into, and a little fuzzy here, but this plaza, the square gathering, it was about, give or take, a $7 million investment. Outdoor dining, it goes back to, I think one of the key things we'll talk a little bit more about is when you are designing your spaces, and I think this connection between business, government, and place and customers is, you need to be flexible now in our space probably more than ever. And I think this is a great example of when you can have your main streets with your corridors or any place, and you can create dynamic space that can be different things on different opportunities, you will have a better place as a whole, not only to gather people, but also in times such as this. So they've created something into it. Secondarily, I'm going to give a quick example when we talk about travel and tourism with Napa. So coming out of the recession, I think a lot of folks, they think of downtown Napa as this, you know, it was a destination, like, you know, bucket list. You know, this was not a place that you really went to. You went up the valley to St. Helena, and you dined at your Michelin star, and you had your limo and all that. That was the viewpoint of Napa in 2009. This is the reality of what Napa really was back in that time coming out of the recession. Their downtown was decimated, huge closed storefronts. And we realized when we were working with them that one of the key things that was driving people away is they would say, I'm walking through downtown and there's all these closed windows. And one of the first things we did is we worked with the art community and we put installations in. And before we knew it, people were talking about, they thought it was intentional. These are great ways that we are, you know, both showcasing the artistic and the culture of the community, but also putting in place the, you no longer have the boarded up storefronts. Again, it was an experience. It's an outdoor experience. And slowly but gradually, that program went away because it filled with stores and it filled with the brick and mortars. But it took about 1 to 2 years time transition before we went from something like this to the empty storefronts to filling it up. We're facing some similar times with that right now. We're seeing more and more of these boarded up storefronts, and there are opportunities to still, for communities, government, and businesses to work together to try and find opportunities while some of our businesses have to pivot and have to find new ways to do things and or reopen their storefronts. So for many of them, they've reimagined it. These are now warehouses that they're doing things out of. But there will be a time we're going to come back and gather together. You have to keep that local engagement. If you build the place for the locals, you will always drive the folks that visit it. I think, again, kind of ending on this and then turning it back to you, James, is, so we go back to travel and tourism. And I think one of the opportunities we're seeing, Michelle, is, yes, people are not getting on planes. They're not going in the big high rise and the fancy, you know, towers and hotels and some of those amusement parks and destinations. Tourism's been decimated. But I think all of us in most recent times have found ways where we're either getting in a car or renting a car or finding a way that we can go somewhere that is outside, that is nature, that is still small, that is still downtown. We can still walk, we can eat outside, we can grab stuff, we can support the local small businesses. We're staying local. And so I think there are some opportunities for some of our communities, if they're not already focused on that, and seeing how they can engage some of those folks within 50, 30, 100, 150 miles driving. It is a huge opportunity, especially if you have the natural attributes around you. You know, the Nye Foundation talks about the 3 things that bind people to place. It's diversity, it's aesthetics, and it's civic amenities or abilities to gather. So granted, we may not be able to gather indoors like this right now, but there are opportunities we can still gather in a community that will still help and support it, whether it's online or otherwise. James, I'm gonna turn it over to you for some questions I think we have.
Yeah, great, Erika. Thank you so much, and thank you, Michelle. I have lots of questions. I've got some that you've provoked in my mind, and I just want to also, Rosie Ramos and our staff has put a prompt in the chat box there. So please, for all of you online right now, please chat away your question. So So this, and I'd love to get a conversation going, right, with the both of you. The SACOG board has this, I think, incredibly interesting commercial quarter task force, and some of you know about this, and the two of you in particular know about it. It's chaired by Rancho Cordova Mayor David Sander. And one of our participants, Julie Young, a developer, I think said it really well. She said, you know, I think COVID in some ways has been an accelerant for things that were already happening. So I guess my first question is about, from a small business perspective, what are some of the things you have seen on the silver lining side, on the strategy side from a small business side, that have enabled them, the ones that have been able to hang on? And one thing I'm curious about in particular is having an online presence.
So, well, I'm happy to, there are a couple of things around that I would probably talk about. So I would just say first, silver linings is always a tricky phrase, because for everyone, you know, everyone's doing these pivots in sort of a terrible environment. And so I just want to be sensitive to the fact that for any small business that might be watching, in no way do we think that COVID is, you know, sort of beneficial to you. But having said that, I think there are some different trends that are happening right now that are going to help the people who make it. And so I completely agree with Erika that we are currently in an environment where we're just accelerating the trends that were already happening. So people were choosing to invest brick and mortar time in places that offered a great experience, offered great customer service, curated distinct and interesting products, and offered some sort of specialty, maybe knowledge or expertise. So those four things were the reasons why we were choosing to invest our time in businesses anyway. And really, to continue to be successful, people are having to take that idea and they're having to figure out, how do they omni-channel that? So omni-channel means, how are you reaching out in different ways to your consumers, not just physically in the brick and mortar arena. And so you still want to execute on those four things in your omni-channel, and you want to think about how you're having layers of messaging. So if I see something online, it's repeated when I'm outside your store in the window. And if I call you, I have that same as a very consistent brand experience across all of those different things. I want to stress a couple of different things too that I think people are discovering that has been fantastic, which is you don't have to fully become Amazon to have a successful online presence. And your online presence, I would even say, omnichannel can be very phone focused. So there's a small toy store here in Portland who has no products online, but she has a very close connection to all of her customers. And she executes on these four things really, really well. And so in the middle of the pandemic, where everyone has a bunch of kids trapped at home, she sells a lot of educational toys and began really segueing and curating products around parents who are trapped at home with their kids and have to work. And so she has a bunch of puzzles, she has educational games, and people just call her and say, help, I need help. And she helps them out, and they, you know, buy over the phone and come and pick up. So I would say that where this is really having a big impact is it's really just reinforcing those kinds of personal relationships. We have to think about how we're reestablishing that trust relationship between consumer and local small business.
So Michelle, the one thing I would add to that is, I think what has been interesting about this and talking to a lot of small business owners is, again, they've almost had to go back to square one in the sense of, when you start a business, whether you create a business plan or not, for most small business owners, they just, you know, they just dig in and start doing what they do best. And before they know it, they've got a business. But it does go back a little bit to think about, you know, do I have a customer list? You know, have I been finding ways to connect with that audience? And having to kind of go back a little bit to the one-on-one and realize that even if you have an online presence, you still need to find a way to share that with your customers one way or another. I think where I have seen, from an online standpoint, some great pivots, whether it's again, and I think we've got very notable ones on the retail and hospitality side, right? So if it is, again, you're selling a product, you're selling a service, we've seen gyms that are now doing, you know, my mom does personal training in the garage now with her trainer via Zoom. So it is amazing to see some of the ways that businesses have pivoted in that regard. But one of the things I would not lose sight of, James, when we talk about, it's not just online. So I think one of the key and critical things that we've seen with this pandemic is the gaps and the holes in our supply chain. And so some of the best pivots I have seen is whether it's small manufacturing, whether it's some of the service industries that have, again, found ways to essentially stop thinking about what you do and just think about what you are really good at. So if it's because you have equipment that you can now change, and instead of cleaning large manufacturing plants and equipment that's no longer running, you can take that and now clean people's office buildings because they want a safe environment for their employees. Again, look at what you have in your assets, and sometimes get out of the focus of just what you do. Well, I just sell a product, or I just do this. Think about your networks and the things that are around you. And I think that is one of the other key things for any business, if you're trying to pivot, is look around you. And I think there's, whether it's looking through your small business development center or others, or the people you know or your industry, and see what they have done. They will probably give you the best advice more than anyone of the trial and error of what they have found. But again, I think we are going to see more and more of these opportunities come out where, and it may be people pivot their business, that they were doing something they never did before, but they had the space, they had a talent, they had an employee set that could do something and accomplish. And again, goes back to solve a problem that was in the community that the business went and kind of found an answer and a solution or a product for.
So we're getting some good questions chatted in now, and as you both know, we're an association of 28 local governments across the region. So we think a little bit about the local government side of this and our elected officials. And I'm actually delighted we've got Supervisor Sue Frost from Sacramento County on this call, the heart of Orangevale, which you both know, and I've certainly learned a lot about that area and a lot of the retail there. So Supervisor Frost asked, how can we help small businesses, such as sole proprietors, who were not able to take advantage of PPP loans?
I mean, there's been an interesting, I think there's a webinar fatigue, and I think that on the part of the public sector, there's a lot of, well, here's my job, which is just sort of to randomly get some information out there with a flyer or webinar, and then I get to clap out and I'm done. And that's not going to work. That's not going to work for our intentionality goals, and that is not going to work for a whole host of small businesses. So we really, there needs to be a lot more one-on-one technical assistance than is happening. And particularly in communities where we have cultural barriers or language barriers, it's even more important that we also get a trust organization to help us be an intermediary in that one-on-one. And I would say there are two big things that are missing. And you'd be amazed at how, I'm not going to say what county, but I was just talking to a woman in a county in your region who was like, you know, I just came here from another state, and the county's not really doing a lot of economic development work. And, you know, they don't think of themselves in that way. And so one of the things I recommended she do is go to the downtown in her county and have some of the connectors just introduce her around to some of the small businesses. Because I said, if you do that, then they're going to reach out to you and ask for help in the things that you guys are providing help for. So I think that one of the things that we do in the public sector is not get out of our office enough. And so I want to see a lot more one-on-one technical assistance, either direct connections between public sector and who they're serving, also bringing people on board to specifically help communities that we want to benefit. And then the third thing is, and I have seen little of this, but I'm really advocating for it everywhere, is can you hire people to be on call for groups of people? So can you hire a lawyer or an accountant or a bankruptcy specialist to take a group of people, a group of businesses, and say like, okay, we want to hire a couple hours of your time to take a group of people kind of through a process or some knowledge-based stuff. But there's just no escaping the hand-holding piece of this. And I would say the last thing that I really see missing, and still here in Portland, I've been very involved in our local COVID response. People email me all the time, like, how do I find out where the latest grant is? Or whether we don't have a one-stop page with just, you know, kind of everything. So people just get lost trying to find all this stuff. So I just think there's no way of escaping. It's not going to be a passive exercise, which is what the public sector kind of approach typically is.
So thank you, Michelle. So with the Metro Chamber, you know, we set up a hotline with our partners at the Asian Chamber in 4 different languages because of the challenges facing many of our small businesses and communities. And part of that was information not being in language for them, not knowing where to find it. Launched a rapid response website specifically to be a hub to cultivate all that information in one place because things were so dynamic and so changing and everything else that went to it. I think, you know, one of the most important things, our businesses right now are doing everything they possibly can to keep their customers. And if our governments in the same regard don't have the same perspective of looking at your businesses and your residents as customers and what you can do to keep them, you will lose them. We are already seeing examples of people now because they can work remotely. They're going, whether it's they're going back home or they're going somewhere else where the cost of living is lower, or better yet, they're not necessarily going where the jobs are, they're going to a place that they do want to live, whether it's because it's walkable or livable, or it's got those civic amenities or those environments they want. But we're, to a point, we're investing the need for the fact that we need more one-on-one technical assistance. You know, if I created a process that made it so difficult for my customer to buy something from me, I would be out of business. And so to the same degree, I think, again, you always want to look at the user experience, and we need to look more at the user experience sometimes, I think, with some of our well-intended, whether it's governments, nonprofits, or similar, of, you know, the small business owner wears many hats. They do not necessarily work from 8 to 5. They do not necessarily have the capabilities to, whether it's previously walk into a counter. We are finding many of our government resources are not even available online for them to do things, be it file a business permit to something else. So part of this goes back to even looking at how can we make that system more not only accessible, but easier for them to understand and use. Recently I saw a grant program for both artists and small businesses, well-intended, but the amount of paperwork they had to submit for the grant, and they had to have a requirement of a $1 million liability policy amongst 3 other requirements the city didn't even ask of many other, we'll just say, larger entities. Again, you're setting up these barriers. So part of this is also look at what, if your business, this is your customer, what are you going to do to retain them and keep them there? And part of that is just make the business of doing business a little bit easier. They're going to work hard. They're going to find a way to get through it, but we got to find some ways that, again, it just bringing those barriers down that they find too often, I think, when they are seeking that assistance.
Okay, I'm going to actually ask for a little bit of help from my staff here. Rosie Ramos on the SACOG staff, our fabulous staff. If Rosie, you could also just monitor the chat. I know we've got a number of questions in there, so.
Yes, we have a few, and I think, Michelle, you actually already saw some of them. You might couple, but we'll read them just in case folks aren't able to read the chat. From Saida, how do places, for Michelle, what can brick and mortar industries do that can't transition online, such as personal services like massage therapists and hairdressers? And then you were going to address Scott's question as well. How do design professionals help businesses reinvent spaces for activities such as outdoor dining, shopping, etc.? And then Erika, I have a question for you afterwards, but I'll let Michelle tackle these ones first.
Well, I really like both of these questions because they really get at a fundamental thing that we're going to have to think about. So I fear the inside is a really big thing that's stopping people from spending protracted periods of time in stores. And it's putting a stop to the professional services piece of the brick and mortar economy. Some people are still getting their hair dyed and getting haircuts, but a lot of people aren't. And so we have to address that. So again, market data, it's really funny. People look at market data and they just get mad at it, and you can't do that. You have to respond to it. If people don't want to be inside, we just got to meet them where we are, and we have to meet them outside, which is where they want to be. And that does not mean having a big giant party. This isn't a street fair. We have to think about, in commercial districts, how we're creating regular times for activities to happen on the exterior. And so the first thing that I would say, and I've been thinking about when I take trips to tropical places like Hawaii, it's pretty common to stumble on somebody getting a massage in a little cabana outside, just separated from the rest of the world by a tiny curtain, right? So one of the things that I would like to see districts doing, especially districts that have some sort of capacity and organization, is creating regular exterior hours, where maybe once a week, maybe twice a week, maybe twice a month, you just bring the inside outside. And there's a whole host of people that will come frequent businesses and services during that time that will not come to things that are inside. There is a challenge right now, particularly around retail, where people are not interested in doing that because they need to staff. If they're going to have inside and outside, they need 2 staff. And right now, all they can afford is 1 staff. So it needs to be kind of a regular thing where inside is kind of closed, you bring stuff outside, and you can even bring personal services outside. I've been to a Comic-Con and people are just out in a booth getting a tattoo. So there's no reason we couldn't set up some exterior cabanas. There's no reason people couldn't be getting their hair cut outside. And fitness is another one. I think it would be so fun to have regular street closures in commercial districts or in suburban districts where we have recessed commercial infrastructure that we're using the parking lots, and we have little circles on the pavement, and we have regular fitness classes outside. And already some of my friends are going to exterior fitness classes that are socially distanced. And so we really need to think about how we're bringing the inside outside, and there's resistance to that. So again, and Erika, this is one of my biggest challenges when I'm doing business technical assistance, is people want to resist market data. They want to say, well, that's stupid, or I can't go outside, or I don't want to go outside, or my business doesn't work outside. None of that matters, because right now your customer does not want to be inside. So you got to meet them where they want to be, which means we all got to be in that game of figuring out how to do stuff outside. So then Scott asked, as a landscape design professional, what are ways that they can help businesses reinvent spaces and leverage the outside? And I think there are some real ways to do that. And so some of what, it's interesting because you have this divide, right? So downtown Sacramento, you have bigger businesses with more resources who can leverage the parklet program and get some exterior seating things going really quickly. In smaller communities, people don't have the capacity to necessarily do that. So what I'm recommending is that smaller jurisdictions create a parking space plaza program. And if they put them in the last parking spaces that are near the curb cuts on the corners, then they can be used as shared seating on the street. You can routinely close the street for a mix of things. And, you know, Scott, one of the things that we've been looking at is how do we design infrastructure so it's kind of flexible, so it can become seating for a restaurant, it could become exterior little merchandising space, or it can be kind of a hangout space on that block. And again, if you take the last space or two on your on-street parking and you put it where there are curb cuts, you also solve the ADA problem, because people can just go down the curb cut ramp and then go straight into kind of a plaza program. And if the city is paying for that, then it's a huge load off for the small businesses, especially on our edge communities. And it's creating sort of a central place. And one of the first businesses to kind of take advantage of being able to do some of that in downtown Marysville, somebody emailed me and said, you know, if you had asked people in Marysville if people would just sit out in a chair in a parking space, they would have said no way. But you know what? Marysville's coming out and they're excited to be out there. We are so starved to be part of the milieu, to be part of our communities, that if we give people these opportunities to do that, they're going to take them. So I would say, Scott, there's 2 places to kind of focus on that. One would be with smaller towns and communities, helping them create, you know, kind of like the, is it Build a Better Blocks? They do those little like sort of box kits where you can do a quick tactical urbanism thing. So thinking of kind of flexible infrastructure that can be used for as a little merchant, a little plaza, a little seating, and help cities bring that out as a plaza program. And then thinking about how recessed strip malls with active uses, with professional services, which are really common, how to help them bring some stuff out for some regular stuff into the private parking space to do that. So I think those are 2 areas we could really use design help. And if you guys are willing to do some pro bono hours on that, I think that'd be amazing.
So Rosie, before we switch to the other question, I just wanted to add to Michelle's point. Before all of this, like my favorite thing about Sacramento was eating outside on a summer evening, and you know the Delta breeze comes through, right? All that stuff. And when the alfresco program was launched here, very similar to what we've seen across the country and throughout the state, one of the first phone calls I got from a reporter was, "Oh, it's going to be too hot in the summer." So again, I think for anyone who has even done a small amount of travel, I have sat and had a pint on a London sidewalk in the middle of rain, and I have, you know, you go to many places that are hot and humid in the summer, and you do not sit inside because those old cities and those old buildings do not have AC, and you're outside under the shade, and that's how, you know, people dine, and they do it in open squares. It goes back to having, I think, as cities and communities, no matter your size, we need to create space that is movable, both inside and outside, that can be dynamic, that can adjust, because again, as communities, we're going to have to adjust. All that is to be said, I think one of the best examples of ways where government and business have worked together is, you know, in the midst of all this, when we kind of started going to reopening in California, ABC, who issues, you know, our licenses for alcohol, beverage, and similar, you know, they did a great job. And I think they understood that if they made businesses wait for the process of getting their expanded premise opened and approved, if they expanded their footprint to serve alcohol outside, it would be December before they saw something. You know, what they did is a little bit of trust and a self-certification process of essentially they opened their office, and at the time they didn't even have necessarily online tools to file. They basically said, look, if you drop off your application, just drop it off. We'll say it's here. We'll mail you your permit. You just start working and doing your deal. And what we found with many cities is they were still so focused on how things were done. They were like, well, you got to have fencing and you got to have this and no, just a majority of our world find ways to use their outside space in dynamic, movable, easy ways. Part of this is sometimes we kind of have to get out of our own way. And I think it's important too, when you go back to the heart and soul of small businesses, small business owners have been taking risk from day one. We see, and out of the recession, you saw a lot of new small businesses start because people, to a degree, they'd already lost everything. They had to change their jobs. They didn't have anything else to lose. We saw our brewery booms in Sacramento coming out of the recession because of this. They are willing to take the risk and the liability. So put that risk and that liability on them. They have to be accountable and responsible for it. But if we set up too many barriers thinking we have to just continue to protect, and this is the way it's done, we're never going to get out of this. Just give them the tools to do that. It's going to take a little adjustment. You know, in doing so, again, we talk about that kind of test and adjust in small business and in creating new products. We're going to have to do the same in this context. But, you know, ABC was a great example. They said, if you've got a parking lot and you border 2 breweries, go ahead and use the shared space. You don't have to separate it. You don't have to define it. You can put a rope up, you can put signs up, but, you know, we trust you to be accountable. You just got to know with that shared space, you have shared liability. I think the last point I think it's important is, and yes, you got to go where the customer is. And I know it is so hard. We have some businesses, no matter how you try, you are not going to be able to operate like you did before, whether it's outside, inside, or otherwise. And at some point, you also got to recognize and look at, and it might be heartbreaking, is, am I better right now in, to a degree, stopping the business I have, doing something else temporarily, or rethinking what I can do? It is not worth taking on more debt. And to Michelle's point, many small business loans are tied to homes and property and everything else. At some point, you got to look at what's my loss, what's my need, and what's my capacity. And as heartbreaking as it might be a time where you have to cut your losses, move away. And if that means you're taking unemployment, if it means you're going in a job somewhere else, if it means that you are rebuilding your empire to something else, but you may at some point have to realize, even if I operate outside, I cannot be profitable. I cannot continue to operate this way. And it is hard and heartbreaking, but at some point as a business owner, you may have to think that as well. And I know, Rosie, we had another question, just I want to make sure we answered.
So I think you might have already touched on this, and this is a question specific to tourist areas for folks or for businesses that are dependent on tourism, and how do they balance the pivoting to new opportunities and the risk of COVID transmission. But before, I think if you can stew on that just a second, I do want to point out before we move away from the other conversation that we're having, a response from SIDA is also that Michelle's recommendation to have businesses go outside, that there's actually some barriers in communities right now where they are not legally allowed to. So there's a good conversation in the chat going on, so we could just bring it up to the forefront so folks that are not able to read it can listen in as well.
And maybe, Rosie, on that, what I would say is, this is a good example of that three-legged stool of customer, business, and government, is I know there's some good intentions in government. So state of California, when they said, yes, if you have a hair salon or barbershop, you can operate outside. But you, again, from a government standpoint, listen to your customer business. If you did not speak to some of the businesses in that space and understand how they operate and their licensing and the regulation and similar, you know, you're not going to be able to operate to that. I think in the same regard too, you have businesses that practice safety every single day. Construction's been a great example of this. So in the world of COVID, they already had safety protocols in place. Again, trust some of your businesses that have those in place and ask them to continue the training and enhance it. Those are the ones that are going to be in a better place to reopen no matter what the environment's going to be. But Michelle, have you seen in other places where those barriers have been kind of pulled back, knowing some folks have a harder time operating outside?
So I think that it has been it's an interesting puzzle in all this, and this is why I really included the public sector and the test track transform. And what I'm seeing too much of is, oh, well, that's not my responsibility. So here's the thing, it's all of our responsibilities to protect small business right now, all of us. And so that means that we need every elected official, even if you're small, to collectively be pushing that up your food chain to say we need to change those things either on a state basis or a city basis or a county basis or whatever that is. So we need leadership to be moving that up the regulatory food chain, because meeting customers where they want to be, which is on the outside, is going to be a critical part of all of this. And that has been one of the big obstacles and barriers to tackling this in jurisdictions all over the country. So I would say that smaller communities, wherever things are in local control, then I think that's one of the benefits of being a small community, because they can just be like, okay, we're going to make it legal to put seating in your parking space, go, right? That's awesome. That's one of the most fantastic things about being a small community. But if you're a small community and you're dependent upon the state moving the dial on something, you know, the state doesn't care about you because your population 5,000. So you need a collective set of voices representing those needs up the food chain.
Rosie, I know you had one other question on travel and tourism, and again, I'll go back a little bit to a couple examples I saw coming out of the recession. I think one of the key things is, you know, like most communities, you want to build it around your locals. You know, at the end of the day, people go where the locals want to be. So whether that's where they eat, whether it's where they assemble, whether it's they hike or they bike or anything else. But if you are a place in a community that has great natural attributes, you have bike trails, you have, again, places where people can get food to go and go sit somewhere and eat in a nice park or anything along those lines, or go hiking or those things. And the key here is people need to feel like they're in a safe environment, whether they're picking up that food curbside to go, or the beer growler, or taking their kids somewhere camping. We are seeing spikes right now in many places where, like Airbnbs, because people feel it's a safer environment than necessarily walking into a hotel. So anything you can do to communicate that safety and what you're doing, from cleaning protocols to similar, I think is important. I think we're also getting that place where people do want to get out of their homes. They still want to gather. They still want to do things together. They still want experiences. So it's going to be a while before we get back on a plane and we go take that big destination trip to somewhere else, but short term, people are going to be looking those communities that are offering things that can be unique. And if that is outdoor experiences, you know, we look at places where they have giant parking lots that aren't being used. There is not a night I don't drive by and the one handful of drive-in movie theaters that I see is not packed and full. You know, look at how, again, you can reimagine some of those spaces to draw people in a safe environment. And part of that might be in their cars. Part of it might be through light shows that you're seeing at night. Part of it might be, again, just knowing that you're taking and doing art exhibits in storefronts until they can reopen, because people can still walk around town. So, you know, I think thinking of those things and locally, and again, reimagine who your customer is. Who your customer might have been for travel and tourism in the past may not be it now. And part of that might be even looking to some of your own local communities in a way that you may not have approached them in the first place.
I just want to stress, I know we're coming at it very, very quickly on parking lots. Means that you have a lot of the one commodity that customers want, which is exterior space that you can be in and control. And so another example that I've heard of is people projecting lights onto a parking garage to create a BMX bike and a skateboard obstacle course. That could be cool. I mean, you have space. Entertainment, you know, you can have an entertainment venue outside possibly for doing some things. So again, fitness, how are we using those spaces to not just benefit, you know, tourism, but benefit local people who go to those businesses, to benefit the businesses that are on the edges of those spaces? We need to think about them really creatively, not just as spaces to store cars.
I knew there would be no shortage of things to talk about and discussion, and I really appreciate everybody who's been involved in the webinar, all the chat questions, and Rosie, thanks for your help on that. I just want to wrap this up and be mindful of people's time, but Erika, like you, I've actually been able to get out of Sacramento the last couple of weeks and travel a little bit on the road and visit places. And the number of small towns that are actually being innovative and flexible and moving into parking lots and public space and as a way to support their small businesses is really inspiring. And I know it's happening in our region, but for all of you who are the local governments listening, I am concerned, and we are concerned that we don't make the barrier, right? We don't want to be the roadblock to this. And if you are interested, please follow up with us, be in touch with us. Rosie, Greg Chu, we have staff, as Michelle knows, who have a Main Streets program that's quite formal. We're getting Michelle out around the region. If there are questions you have or ways in which we can support you, back to the climate that is on our side, and in terms of the weather right now, right? We're going to getting into we have a tremendous opportunity with the fall months and really pilot testing a lot of these ideas. So I really want to thank Michelle and Erika, both of your time, but your just incredible expertise and your wisdom. It's always inspiring to hear you both. I want to thank everybody who participated today, and that is a wrap. So thanks very much to everybody.
James, if you wouldn't mind, I know today's a day our country's kind of celebrating John Lewis. There's a quote he had that I just thought was very appropriate for this conversation.
Great way to wrap it.
He said, governments and corporations do not live, they have no power, no capacity in and in themselves. They are given life and derive all their authority from their ability to assist, benefit, and transform the lives of the people they touch. All authority emanates from the consent of the government and the satisfaction of the customer. And, and the crux of it, again, we're all in this together. We got to find ways to work together. And I don't know, I just felt like the words very much fit the time and the place of what we're dealing with right now.
I love it. Thank you. And thanks to everybody. That is a wrap. Please be in touch with us.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.